All right, just about got things lined up. The YouTube monitor running, so I can keep an eye on that. And let's go ahead and begin with the warning. So today in our study, we are going to be looking at chapter 25 in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. And we're not looking at all of it, but the section that we are looking at is going to deal with slavery. Now, I talked a little bit in this section last year about slavery from the Eved Ivri point of view, that is to say, for a Hebrew slave. But we did not go into great depth for a slave that was not an Israelite slave. This year we are going to. And I will warn you right now that you probably will be unhappy and uncomfortable with the rulings on this topic. I should also warn you, do not assume that the rulings and opinions from antiquity are the values that are used in the modern world, and indeed have not been used in the modern world for centuries or more. So we are going to find out that, yes, indeed, slavery of a chattel type, not, again, equivalent to the American experience, and we'll talk about the distinction as we go, but still an uncomfortable form of buying and selling of other people was permitted under Jewish law. And we're going to talk about why that was. We're going to talk about what the limits were, and we're going to talk about how we should feel about something as difficult as this in the modern world. So it is going to be a difficult conversation, and I want to make sure everybody understands that and is prepared for that before we begin. So with that obligatory warning in place, let's go ahead and get down to work. Now, chapter 25 of Vayikra, Leviticus, is talking about the sabbatical and the Jubilee. It talks about the idea of allowing the land to rest, of not harvesting and not planting in particular for the land, and giving it that sabbatical release. It talks about the Jubilee, which comes every 50 years, and which has not only a double year of letting the land lie fallow, but also the official, formal, and required liberation of all Jewish slaves to allow them to return to their ancestral holdings, the ancestral holdings as well being returned to the original families that had them allocated. Now, that part we've talked about in more detail, but we're going to talk a little bit more about how somebody would end up as a slave, and then we're going to see the contrast between the slaves that came from within the community and those that came from outside the community. And like I said, the distinction is not pleasant. It is not something that we currently practice, but it is something I think that we will be able to still learn, not only what Torah talked about in the past, but also some of the values that we have that were both then and now, and are very strong and positive for ourselves and for the world. But to understand how a person could become a slave within the community, we're going to begin on verse 35. By the way, throughout, I'm going to use the translation that's here mostly, but just understand the phrase kin is used as a metaphorical translation for the word ach, which means brother or sibling. So the Torah text itself is very much trying to emphasize the closeness within the community, that everyone, whether they come from the same father or mother or not, should be looked at as being your brother, as being part of your closest family connection. If your kin, being in straits, comes under your authority and are held by you as though resident aliens, let them live by your side. Do not exact advanced or accrued interest, but fear your God. Let your kin live by your side as such. Do not lend your money at advanced interest, nor give your food at accrued interest. So this section here is talking about somebody that has become desperately poor, and that you should take them in and you should help them, They have essentially lost their holding, and now they are as though they were strangers. That's this phrase, being a resident alien. They have no land that they can claim and use as the means of production for their livelihood. But nonetheless, while you should lend to them, you have to make sure you don't lend with interest. That is to say, putting a penalty, making profit off of their misfortune, saying, sure, I'll give you 100 shekels to buy back your land or to buy new seed, but you're going to have to pay me back 110 shekels is not allowed in Judaism. You should not exploit another person's difficult situation. And we see as a justification for this, I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. So we can see that God has the right to tell us what to do with our land and to remind us of what it felt like when we were in Egypt, because God is the instrument of our deliverance and of our gift. 39, if your kin unto you continues in straits and must be given over to you, and the phrase here, given over, is a little bit stronger in the Hebrew. They are sold to you. Do not subject them to the treatment of a slave. Now, they are going to be put into a similar position. But as you can see, verse 40 tries to tell us, remaining with you as a hired or bound laborer, they shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. So there's a distinction that's being made here. They will technically be an eved in a legal sense, that is to say a slave, but they should only be treated as though they were a hired or indentured laborer. And that is reminding us that their treatment has to be exceedingly humane. More about that in the commentaries. And of course, we're being reminded in chapter 25 in particular that their service, even if it extends past the sabbatical release by the slave's own desire, is terminated forcibly, no matter what people wish, at the time of the Jubilee. And at that point, verse 41, then they, along with any children, shall be free of your authority. They shall go back to their family and return to their ancestral holding. For they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over them ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. So we see a number of different points here that we've talked about in the past, just last year, if I'm not mistaken, that while they are working, they have to be treated with respect and dignity. They cannot be treated ruthlessly. This phrase of giving them work that is either degrading or too difficult, that is a prohibited, a step too far in their obligation to you as their master during this time period. And we are reminded that, of course, they are allowed to go free eventually because God freed them from Egypt. They technically belong to God, not to whoever may currently be in charge of them. And as such, when God says it's time for them to go back, they must be released. All right, so all of this, like I said, we talked about last year, and we saw many of the limits on our slavery with regards to Hebrew slaves. Such male and female slaves as you may have, it is from the nations round about you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of alien residents among you, or from their families that are among you, whom they begot in your land. They shall be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves. But as for your Israelite kin, no one shall rule ruthlessly over another. Okay, so we're going to stop there because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for the commentary because it might get contentious. But this is where we see a distinction being drawn between children that come from the land of Israel and children that do not. And by children, of course, we just mean residents, not physical children. First, the question has to come up, why is there being a distinction here? Well, the distinction is, unfortunately, because of the narrowness of economic life in the ancient world. The ancient world was built around agriculture as its form of production. You lived or died for 90% of the population based on how well you could farm. And as we saw, farmers might have trouble and they have to sell themselves or take out loans to get back on their feet, but even that might not be enough, and then they become a slave. But then when their land is returned to them, they return to the land and they start the process again. Other parts of the Torah talk about sending them off with gifts to make sure that they can reboot their life in good ways, but it is very much an economic structure. People lose that land because of bad luck, and then they return to that land because of Torah, and they try again. Well, somebody that is not an Israelite would, of course, not have an ancestral holding. There wouldn't be a chelek, there wouldn't be a portion for them in the land. And so then the question becomes, well, what happens when you reach that moment of Jubilee? Are they released? Are they not released? Can you release them even? Well, that's something we're going to have to discuss, but it is not obvious what happens. That's why the Torah has to discuss it. And the other question comes that slavery for much of the ancient time period was a matter of acquiring labor that could be used to make sure that both the person working as well as the family with them, who would always be, almost always be working alongside of them, would be able to benefit. So the question then becomes how to make sure that that will work in a way that is in keeping with the rest of the Torah's values. Now, the kicker, as we're going to see, is that there are a couple of distinctions for these non-Israelite slaves. One of them is that we get the phrase that they can be a possession le'olam, that they will be a possession, a member of the family property for all time. And that is going to be a difficult topic for us to discuss. On top of that, we see again a repeat that we can treat these as slaves, but not treat our kin ruthlessly, this befarech phrase. Well, does that mean the opposite? If I'm specifically told I can treat the non-Israelite as a slave, but I can't treat the Israelite slave ruthlessly, does that mean that I can treat a non-Israelite slave ruthlessly? And that's going to have to be a conversation as well. Now, I just want to lay down on the board something very, very quick as the distinction between this form of slavery and the other forms of chattel slavery that we know from other parts of the world, and of course from America's own dark past. And that is that these non-Israelite slaves could still be emancipated if the owner commits acts of violence against them. In that famous section back in Mishpatim, in the book of Exodus, when it talks about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it also talks about what happens if you knock out the tooth or an eye or other forms of significant injury to one of your slaves. And the answer is that they go free. If you knock out a slave's tooth, that slave now goes free. Their obligation to you is nullified by the violence you perpetrated against them. So there were limits to how a person could treat a slave legally without losing them. So they are not animals, and they are not treated the same way as other property. I can break a plate in my house without having to worry about all my other plates being set free or something. But they are being put in a position where they will work and their children will work in perpetuity. And they are being put in a position where they can be treated harshly, it seems, in a way that should, I believe, make us uncomfortable. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood that this was not a one-to-one comparison to the American slave system, but also to still be uncomfortable. If you're not squirming a little bit about this, then you're not paying attention to the overall arc of Judaism's teachings. And if you're just tuning off because you don't want to hear about these parts of Judaism because it makes you feel uncomfortable, then you're also not paying proper respect to the fact that this is something our ancestors had to struggle with and work through in the way that their economy and society were structured 3,000 years ago. All right, so I'm going to pause there. Questions or comments? And be prepared, I may tell you we'll handle that in the commentary, but go ahead.
Quick question. If a slave owner, for example, murders their slave, kills them, they would be liable in a Jewish court, as opposed in our American system where that's just considered as if you broke a jar that you owned.
Yes. So those forms of crime would be punishable by a court. And like you said, that is a difference between this and the American system in its worst periods. All right, so let's look at our commentary. And to do that, we're going to start off by first looking a little bit as a reminder of the treatment of slavery when it is a Eved Ivri, when it is a Hebrew slave, a Jewish slave. So first, we just get a reminder about how we treat a Jewish slave. You must not rule over him to crush him, as we talked about. On the contrary, you should be generous with him and tell him, maybe God will help you and provide you with a redeemer, or you will gain the funds in some other way through divine providence. So Amek Davar is trying to remind us that as we don't treat them harshly, there is actually a positive side to that as well, that we should be supportive. This is underscoring the idea that many people who were selling themselves into slavery within the community were doing so out of dire circumstances. And the people who were helping them were not cackling, whip-cracking slave owners. They were neighbors or other members of the community that couldn't afford to simply give money away. That was not often an option for most of the people of this time period, but they could afford to pre-hire the person to bring them into their community for work and labor for a set period of time. But they should do it, he is arguing, not as a gleeful exploitation of the vulnerable, but as a last resort, and with words of consolation and encouragement of saying, hey, you're going to work with me and we'll look after you and you'll do your job. But, you know, maybe somebody will show up and they'll be able to pay off your debt, and then you can go back to your land. Or maybe you'll find something or some other way. Divine providence will look out for you and you can get out of this horrible situation. This is an owner that doesn't want to be an owner. This is an owner that is stepping in to help another person in what was an economically feasible way in the ancient world, but should still do so with a sense of humanity and dignity to the person in need. Indeed, because of the way Judaism looks at this situation of working with a Hebrew slave, Kiddushin in the Talmud says, anyone who acquires a slave is like he who has acquired a master. Basically, the idea being that to have a slave puts you under a set of restrictions for his treatment that are quite strong, to the point that he can make demands on you. The Talmud goes on in great detail in different places to talk about the fact that your slave has to sleep well just like you, they have to eat well just like you, they obviously rest just like you when it comes to Shabbat, that you cannot treat them in humiliating ways, you cannot degrade them, you cannot give them meaningless work or other types of activities, that this person is working for you essentially like an employee more than a slave in the classical understanding of slavery. And that because of that, you now have obligations to them, just as they have an obligation to work for you. And it's a very much a two-way street is what the Talmud is trying to get across here. So that is sort of just a brief synopsis of the general treatment for a Jewish slave by a Jewish owner in this time period. And I put this here because we need to contrast it with the way the text and the commentators talk about a non-Jewish slave, because we need to be honest and upfront about this distinction. Again, this distinction is fundamentally rooted within the idea of the national economy being based upon the land that was divided at the time of Joshua according to the tribal allocations, which means that only people that had been part of that system have a recognizable means of production. But even with that economic understanding of the institution, it is still very uncomfortable how this distinction is made. So we'll turn to Rashi as he makes it clear what's going on here. And well, if you should say, but if this be so, what I just talked about, that I must treat my Jewish servant with so much regard, by whom shall I be served, right? Over my Jewish servants, I have no power, right? If I have a Jewish slave, I still have to treat them with such dignity that they're basically like an employee, and in some ways even have better treatment than employees because I have obligations to take care of them. Now, who's going to be my servant if not one of them? Of the Canaanite people, I cannot possess any, for you have warned me in Deuteronomy, you shall not keep any soul alive. So I'm apparently not supposed to keep them. So if I come into the land and my Jewish servants cannot really be servants, and the Canaanites get wiped out during the time of conquest, who then shall serve me? Right, so this is the lament of the nation, because in the ancient world, having slaves, having servants, was an essential element for the economy. Now, we have obviously moved well past that, and thank God, our economy has developed beyond the slavery system. But as anyone who's ever studied historical economic systems and theory will tell you, slavery is a feature of all ancient societies. It is something that naturally arises, unfortunately, when you reach a certain level of complexity and agricultural focus. And this lament is not about, I want to have a slave. This lament was, without slavery, how can the economy work? And that was the unfortunate feeling 3,000 years ago. But wait, there is an answer. Then I, meaning God, replies, of the other nations, they may be servants to you. So what this means is that the other nations, meaning the non-Canaanite nations, whether they be from Ammon or Edom or Moab or any of the other countries that were around Israel, people that had been sold from those countries and brought to Israel, they could be purchased, and those could be full slaves. Those could be treated differently and more work extracted from their labor than done from the Jewish slaves. And that was answering this economic question, this potential catastrophe if such servants couldn't be found. Now, again, this does not justify the economic system. This does not say that it was a good system, but in the system of the day, this would have been a true concern. Obviously, we in hindsight can say that there are better ways of organizing a society that do not rely upon slaves, both for the benefit of those enslaved as well as for those that are doing the enslaving. But at that time period, they were unable to transition to those forms of economy in a timely manner. But had they wanted to, that is to say, had it occurred to them to transition, could they have? And by could, I mean, is there a legal prohibition? And you're going to have to buckle up for this discussion. Take your bondmen forever. Remember, I pointed out that word olam, that these non-Jewish slaves would be your slaves forever, that they, their children, grandchildren would be passed down as part of the inheritance you gave to your children. One is permitted to do so. That is to say, one is permitted to keep them forever. Unlike a Jewish slave, which, as we see from the rest of chapter 25, has to go free regardless in the Jubilee year, a non-Jewish slave is able to be kept forever. But is it able? Well, actually, the sages Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael differ on this point. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, aha, we're going to find somebody who is anti-slavery. No, not exactly. The difference here is about whether someone has to keep them as a slave for, not can they keep them as a slave forever, but whether they have to keep them as a slave forever. Meaning that, are you prohibited from liberating your slave if they are a non-Jewish slave? That's the argument that that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael are having. Now, this is a grammatical argument that is part of a set of arguments that Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva have. And if we look in the Talmud and Masechet Sota, we'll see that they're arguing about warning of the wife before the giving of the bitter waters, and the way it works out. And he warned his wife. It is optional, meaning that you don't have to warn your wife if you come into a situation where you have reasonable grounds to suspect that she is drawing close to intimacy with someone else, but you are allowed to warn your wife. This is the statement of Rabbi Ishmael, but Rabbi Akiva says it is mandatory. Not you can warn the wife, but you must warn the wife. Likewise, for her, he may become impure, from Leviticus 21, just a little while ago, meaning that a priest can participate in the burial of his sister. Again, Rabbi Ishmael says this is optional. He may become impure. Priests, remember, had to remain ritually pure at all times, except when it came to the burial of one of their close relatives. And Rabbi Ishmael is saying that a priest can choose to become ritually impure to take care of his relative, or he could choose not to go to be part of the burial and thus remain ritually pure because he doesn't come into contact with the deceased. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, it is mandatory. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that the Kohen doesn't get to choose whether or not he wants to go to the funeral, but instead the Kohen has to go to the funeral, has to render himself ritually impure. That the he may phrase is in fact an obligation rather than an option. And this same argument is held between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva with regards to non-Jewish slaves. Rabbi Ishmael says a person can keep a slave forever, but they can also free them if they feel like it. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, a person who has a non-Jewish slave must keep them as a slave forever. They are never allowed to give them their freedom. And that, I imagine, and I hope, is a rather surprising view. Rabbi Akiva lived, along with Rabbi Ishmael, during one of the worst periods of Jewish history. Jews were being taken as slaves routinely by the Roman Empire. And indeed, after the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt, for which Rabbi Akiva himself will be brutally tortured and murdered by the Romans, the number of Jewish slaves thrown into the market completely destroyed the economy of slavery, because so many of us were taken into captivity. So it's probably surprising that anyone would say, you have to keep this person forever. Well, of course, Rabbi Akiva is arguing grammar here rather than morality. He is arguing that in these statements, it is not about a choice, it is about an obligation. And since the grammar of our line regarding slaves is the same, he argues that it is the same. Meaning that the slavery is not optional, that once a slave comes into your possession, that you are responsible for keeping them a slave in perpetuity. Now that opinion is controversial. As you can see, it is debated. Rabbi Ishmael says it's perfectly fine to manumit, to emancipate a slave earlier. But under what circumstances? Well, the Talmud in a different section goes into a bit more of a discussion on that. There was a certain maidservant in Pumbedita. In this case, we know by the context that this is a non-Jewish slave, with whom people were performing prohibited acts. It seems that there was an understanding that she was a willing participant in various sexual acts with people whom she should not be with. Abaye said, if not that Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says that anyone who emancipates his slave violates a positive mitzvah, I would force her master and he would write her a bill of manumission. Okay, so Rav Abaye is saying the way to solve this problem is to set her free. Because if you set her free, A, she would become Jewish, and B, she would get married, and then C, she would no longer be in a position to perform these various acts with these other people. But he feels that he cannot do that because he follows the line of Rabbi Yehuda, who followed the line of Shmuel, one of the earlier rabbis, that basically agreed with Rabbi Akiva, that freeing a slave violates a positive commandment, and thus this option is not available. However, Ravina said, in a case like that, Rav Yehuda concedes due to the prohibited manner. Ravina brings, one of the other rabbis of the Talmud, says, no, you don't understand. Rav Yehuda actually does agree that in a case like this, where there is a violation going on because of the person's continued position as a slave, that emancipating them would in fact be perfectly permitted. So we see here a walking back of Rabbi Akiva's opinion of never freeing a non-Jewish slave to institute an idea that if there is an avera, if there is a sin, that allowing her to be free would in fact be the best solution. It's not giving blanket permission to emancipate, but it is saying there is a circumstance to prevent a sin for emancipation. However, we move on. The Gemara asks, and does Abaye hold that one cannot emancipate a slave due to a prohibition that is being violated? So does Abaye actually disagree with this? Didn't Rav Chanina bar Rav Katina say that Rav Yitzchak says there was an incident involving a woman who was a half-maid servant, half-free woman, as she belonged to two masters and was emancipated by one of them. And yes, it gets complicated how this works. Right, so there was a situation where that something like this quite happened. And indeed, there was an additional situation. There was an incident involving Rabbi Eliezer, who entered a synagogue to pray, and he did not find 10. We need a minyan, we need 10 people in order to have the full part of our service. He comes in and there are only 9, and he emancipated his slave and had him complete the 10. So he frees his slave, which because of the process of Brit Milah that happens when a slave comes into a household, they are circumcised. Basically, by freeing them, they become a Jewish person. And so now he counts as part of the minyan, and we have solved the problem of the minyan. Now, the Gemara answers, freeing a slave to enable the performance of a mitzvah is different. This does not, says the other opinion, demonstrate that in general one is permitted to emancipate a slave. So we've gotten 2 different examples here. One, freeing a slave in order to prevent a sin seems to be permitted, and freeing a slave to complete a mitzvah seems to be permitted. As you can see, the sages of the Talmud, who are moving further and further from the time of the forms of slavery in the ancient world and the reliance upon slavery that was so common in the ancient world, and especially as they were moving away and away from that economy for themselves and their communities in large part, are finding more and more reasons to not prohibit. There are more and more reasons to allow the emancipation of non-Jewish slaves, and for good cause. That is to say, to avoid a transgression or to enable a fulfillment of a commandment, which you can imagine could happen on a fairly regular basis, and indeed could happen on a staged basis. If somebody wanted to emancipate their slave, all they would have to do would be to arrange for 9 people to be forming a minyan, and then come in with their slave, say, I only see 9, and now I can free my slave without any violation. That this then creates a loophole that is a mile wide. Likewise, a person could say that the continuation of the enslavement of this person is only going to create more transgressions, and therefore it is justified to emancipate them to avoid that. Now, in Mishnah Torah, which is written later in Rambam's time, about 1,000 years ago, Rambam says the following about this idea of emancipating. He does agree that for the need of a mitzvah or for the prevention of a sin, that emancipation is perfectly fine, like we just saw. But he also gives the following wrinkle. Similarly, it is forbidden for a person to free a Canaanite slave, meaning a non-Jewish slave. So that does remain the default position. And anyone who who frees such a slave violates a positive commandment, as we see in Leviticus 25:46, and you shall have them work for you forever, the verse we have been focusing on. Nevertheless, if the master frees him, he attains his freedom. And once he frees him, we compel his master to compose a bill of release for him, conforming to all the laws we have described. So there needed to be a document that attested to a slave's emancipation in order that it would never be doubted that this person was free, so they would never be subject to attacks or people trying to return them to slavery. What Rambam is saying here, which is unusual for most mitzvot, is that if you violate the commandment and free them anyway, just free them, not for good cause, not because you're avoiding a sin and not because you are trying to complete a mitzvah, but just you felt like freeing them, that they actually stay free. Now, often if you commit a transgression, the transgression will invalidate the action that you were trying to perform. Classic examples, such as if I steal someone else's lulav, and then I try to do the mitzvah of lulav for Sukkot, it doesn't count. I cannot be said to have credit for having done the mitzvah. But here, it does count, and the slave is freed. Even if the owner had violated a commandment, their freedom is legit, and they get the full document as it should be, and that person is considered free in perpetuity. Before we get to his general view on how we deal with these non-Jewish slaves, any questions so far on this topic of the emancipation, the manumission of slaves in time? Okay. Now, lest you think that because of this notion that our attitude towards the slaves was like treating them as was done in the American experience, I wanted to make sure that we saw from somebody who even just said that we don't free them, how they are to be treated. Now, he does start off, this is Rambam still, it is permissible to work a heathen slave relentlessly. Okay, now this relentlessly is a technical term, and it is the contrast, right? We cannot work a Jewish slave relentlessly, but we can work a non-Jewish slave relentlessly. But immediately after saying that, yes, that is legally an option, even though it is lawful, the quality of benevolence and the paths of wisdom demand of a human being to be merciful and striving for justice. One should not press his heavy yoke on a slave and torment him, but should give him to eat and drink of everything. The sages of old were in the habit of sharing with the slave every dish they ate, and they fed the cattle as well as the slaves before they themselves sat down to eat. So there is a general rule that, yes, technically it is allowed, but no decent person would ever behave in that way. Instead, they should eat from your table, and you should make sure they have enough to eat before you sit down to fill your own stomach. And that basic level of human dignity and decency should be extended to them. They are not less than your consideration. They are not meant to be disregarded in their humanity. Indeed, nor should a master disgrace his servant by hand or by words. The biblical law surrendered them to servitude, but not to disgrace. This is critical, and something that is often missed when we understand the actions of our ancestors and confuse them with the actions of others. That yes, Rambam agrees, as did the Talmud before him, that there is a place within Jewish law, for their generations at least, that did allow Jews to own slaves, and to own slaves that weren't Jewish forever. However, even though the Torah gave that permission, it never gave permission to treat a person disgracefully. It never gave permission to humiliate a person. That was not part of the Torah's permission. The Torah said, yes, they can be your servant, but not that you can treat them like dirt. Instead, he should not madly scream at his servant, but speak to him gently and listen to his complaints. This is explicitly stated with regard to the positive paths of Job for which he was praised. And we see in Job 31, 13, and 15, have I ever shunned justice for my slave and maidservant when they quarreled with me? Did not he who made me in the belly make him? Was it not the one who prepared us in the womb? So in this passage in Job, he is trying to say that he had been such an upright person because we know that he didn't even mistreat his servants, his slaves. And whether or not he'd had permission to, he saw that they were still people. They came from the same source, the same one who prepares all of humanity for this world. Cruelty is frequently to be found only among idol worshippers. The children of our father Abraham, however, the people of Israel upon whom God bestowed the goodness of the Torah, commanding them to keep the laws of goodness, are merciful toward all creatures. So too, in speaking of the divine attributes which he has commanded us to imitate, the psalmist says, his mercy is over all his works. Whoever is merciful will receive mercy. As it is written, he will be merciful and compassionate to you and multiply you. So Rambam finishes off his discussion in this section on the treatment of non-Jewish slaves by setting a bar that again is much higher than you might have expected, by putting into words this notion that yes, it is technically allowed, and indeed in Rambam's time it wasn't very uncommon, because he lived in the Muslim world where slavery was still more prevalent, but that for the dignity of the Jewish slave owner himself, that person needed to stay far away from the cruelty that was often found in other cultures, that they needed to act with goodness, with kindness, with mercy towards the people that were in their care, that were in their charge, that whatever the technical legal options were, that a person should always adhere to the truth of God and the truth of our people, which is to be merciful for all. And you can see he even slides in a little self-serving idea that if you are merciful to them, then God will be merciful to you. And this really is the sort of the beginning of the end of slavery within Judaism. Like I said at the beginning, we already had seen a massive tempering of slavery for Jews within the community, as found within the Torah itself, and then continually ratified and reinforced through rabbinic teachings. But over the years as well, it became more and more explicit that the keeping of non-Jewish slaves was not an ideal or worthwhile enterprise, and that even if one did have them, that there could be many grounds for releasing them, despite the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that had become the sort of official on paper opinion, that there could be many opportunities to free them. And indeed, even if one didn't avail themselves of one of the loopholes to free them, that one would still not be, that their emancipation would still be legitimate and efficacious, and they would still go free. And this created a position where quite rapidly in the different communities, at a different pace, Jews did divest themselves of slaves. It was simply no longer normal within a Jewish community for a Jewish person to have an eved of any type, whether they be Jewish or non-Jewish. We simply stopped holding slaves as a feature of our society. Could it have happened earlier? Perhaps. Like I said, the historical economic situation argues against that. Certainly in the West, it took another almost 500 years before slavery was abolished to the same extent. And unfortunately, in our day and age, slavery is still common around the world in many other cultures. And many people are also imprisoned in virtual slavery, depending upon their relationship to whatever their employment might be. But I think we should be honest that, yes, at that time, there was an institution which makes most of us feel very uncomfortable and disgusted. And the reason that we have that discomfort and disgust is precisely because of the teachings that Rambam is bringing to bear here, that the Torah has made it clear throughout its text, and the Tanakh has reinforced this, that such slavery is not right, that the keeping of other people is not the ideal. This is not something that should be lauded or sought after. This is something that is fraught with peril, not only because we might treat them badly, but because in doing so, we also corrupt our own sense of what is right and wrong. And we should be grateful that over history, we found a way to release this part of our society, to escape from this shackle of the economy, and to live without slavery, and to find that indeed society was better for them and for us. And may that freedom be something that is experienced by everyone soon in our day and forevermore. Additional questions or comments?
I have a question looking forward to Shavuot.
Yes.
Ruth,
go ahead, John, first.
I say Ruth is a Moabite, and of course Rashi says it's, from the Moabites you can own slaves. What is that? How does that color the entire story of Ruth, or is that even something that's hanging in the background, that this is someone who normally would be a slave in our community?
Well, not only would she normally be a slave, but there was a general distaste for the Moabites because of how they treated us when we were coming out of Egypt. However, the example of Ruth as somebody who was a righteous convert, somebody who chose Judaism very passionately and very deeply, is precisely there to remind us that there are people who were not born within the Jewish community that nevertheless hear the call of Torah very, very strongly and come into our community as our brothers or sisters. So it's the idea of the Moabites being our slaves. There was never, and maybe I should have pointed this out, and I thank you for the opportunity, there was never a feeling that these people should all be our slaves, that somehow we had a claim over them. This was about permission, not about a right to dominate. Unlike later cultures that would often claim that it was their God-given or the law of nature told them they were allowed to dominate one race or one nationality over another. Judaism didn't say that we had a right to all the Moabites as slaves. It simply said, if you have a slave, it could be from Moab. But then Ruth comes along and says, yeah, and that person actually could also end up being Jewish, and that would also be perfectly fine. I should also point out, just because it's always important to repeat, that by the time the Talmud came along after the destruction of the Assyrians and the destruction of the Babylonians, we no longer believed that people who lived in those territories were the actual descendants of those nationalities. So there is no Moabite in the modern world, and there hasn't been for 2,000 years. So no one is still governed by the laws of those nationalities. I believe there was another comment. Yes.
Yes, I was wondering, because I'm not from this part of the country, how, if this is in Torah texts and Talmud texts and Mishnah Torah, a Mishnah Talmud, how did Southern Jews who were plantation owners treat their slaves?
So first of all, there were not many Southern Jews that were in that level of society. But there were definitely Jews who did own slaves. There were some Jews who did involve themselves in the slave trade. And unfortunately, the same way that we have in the modern world our own Bernie Madoffs, that is to say, people who claim the mantle of being Jewish, but act in ways that are completely contradictory to Jewish teaching. Unfortunately, many of the Jews in the South did behave contrary to the teachings of Judaism. It's not really surprising, as we know many people in the modern world that are Jewish don't know the actual teachings of our people and behave however they feel like, aping the community in which they are in, so too many Jews in the South did the same. They were neither better nor worse than the other slave owners in that community. Some behaved more beneficently, others behaved just as cruelly as many of the non-Jewish slave owners. I will point out, however, that there are many amazing sermons and divrei Torah that were written both in the South and in the North from rabbis and Jewish teachers that did talk against the crimes of slavery and did argue that slavery should be abolished in the United States. And there were far more Jews on that side of the argument, both officially as well as just in the straight numbers, than those that held slaves. I wish that I could say that the Jewish people were not at all involved in the American slave experience, but unfortunately, there were, just like there were Jewish mobsters in the 20s and Jewish con artists throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Many of our people don't always live up to the ideals of our people. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Reminder that Lag BaOmer is beginning tonight and tomorrow. So let's have a joyful celebration of that turning point in our own history when the plague that rocked our people, the persecutions following the Bar Kokhba revolt began to come to an end. Let's use that as a reminder that the persecutions of others too should always be brought to an end. Take care.
Thank you.